Welcome to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, where I cover topics and issues that will help you take a stand for Christ in culture. More than ever, followers of Jesus need courage to stand up, speak up, and to live out their faith, because people need to know that there's a God in heaven that loves them, and it is His truth that sets people free. Thanks for listening today, and I hope that you enjoyed the episode. Hey, I want to welcome you to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast. It is my joy and privilege to have back on the podcast Brittany Leboeuf. Brittany is a skilled scientist, fitness educator, consultant with a history of working in academia and the health and fitness industry. She has her PhD. She is brilliant. She has the Heaven and Health podcast, and she is wise and in tune with what's happening within the culture. So today we're going to hit, I think, an important issue in just a few moments. But Brittany, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
So last time you were on, we discussed, some important issues. We hit some similar topics as we're going to hit on now. But we talked about what last time? Do a brief recap on that.
Yeah, so last time I was on the podcast, we talked about queer theory and how that has kind of infiltrated into our society in various different forms, everything from what our kids are seeing in their education, but in particular, Drag Queen Story Hour and kind of the origins of where that event came from and the ideology that underlies it. And there are some problematic things, to say the least, about where all of that comes from. And so we did just like a debrief. So I'd encourage you to listen to that episode if you haven't, because a lot of it ties in with what we're going to talk about today too.
Yeah, it really it does. And so I thought you did a great job kind of giving a primer on, the queer pedagogy, the basis or the foundations of where all of these things come from. And I want to kind of jump to today's topic, and we'll go back and forth. And it's really a big deal, because when I talk about the erasure of women, specifically with a focus around something known as Title IX. And so if you're not familiar with what Title IX is, on Friday, the Biden administration released a long-awaited regulation that amends Title IX, which is something that has been in existence, I think, since, I believe, 1972. I've done a fair amount of reading on it today, but all the dates begin to go together for me. And it redefines sex in federal law to include gender identity, which is no small issue. This effectively erases women as a protective category because it allows any male to claim that as an identity. The U.S. Department of Education released a final rule under Title IX on April 19th, claiming it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance. Now, that's a big one. The DOE said that final regulation promotes educational equity and opportunity for students across the country, as well as accountability and fairness. But the reality is it does no such thing. So kind of jump in with your thoughts, and let's talk about this important issue.
Yeah, so while this has kind of been long awaited and suspected, the actual ruling coming out, I think, was still a very important moment, because it shows that, one, no one voted on this. It was something that was just decided. And so it's not even as if, there are things that can happen now legally to, upend this and whatnot, but it shows how important it is who we have in office and the people that they appoint, as the Department of Education, brought this forward, and who sits on all those boards and all those things. That all matters, and sometimes it matters more than others. And this is an example of it mattering more than others. I think it's really interesting to me that, not interesting, I guess I could say it in a pejorative way, but, we hear a lot about protecting the marginalized, and so much of the cultural conversation right now comes to that very thing, whether it's, women's rights, so quote unquote, or immigrants, things like that. But when it comes to protecting women, it just seems like there is a blind spot, so to speak, and that no one is really recognizing how the erasure essentially of women is going to impact society, and why that's a negative thing, and why we should not be supporting it. And I think a lot of the conversation is, oh, that's, fear mongering, and you're reading into things too much, and that's not what this is. And I think that's a really naive take, a really naive way to look at it. And I'm pregnant with my first daughter, and as a parent of a little girl in particular, all kids, but especially a little girl, I just cannot understand why this isn't causing more outrage, to be quite honest. And I think that we need to really think about why that is, and to work on some courage to stand up for this issue, because it's very important, and it will affect our lives and our children in particular in the future.
You're right. And, you might say, okay, what's Title IX? What does this have to do with me? Why is it a big deal? Why is it important? So let me go back for a moment. We sent out an email on this past Wednesday. So it'd be a week ago by the time this podcast comes out. And Title IX was enacted as a part of the Educational Amendments 1972. So I nailed it, got that right. It protects people from discrimination based on sex and education programs and activities that receive federal funds. It states, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So the Department of Education, or the DOE, is tasked with creating rules that implement Title IX. So their newly published rule, which clocks in at over 1,500 pages, and that's a warning right there. Anything that feels the need to have that many pages, we see this with our Congress and the laws that are established. It's intentionally to make it confusing so that common sense and honest discussion around real issues is kind of set to the side. You don't even know, the average person doesn't even know where to begin. So it stipulates that sex discrimination, which will now also include discrimination on the basis of sex stereotypes, sex characteristics, pregnancy, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So the issue related here within this is we see culturally there's an attack on all social norms. I say it's ultimately a war against God. Now, culturally, we say it's a decolonization or the deconstruction of the Western influence. But when someone says that, they're essentially saying it's a war against the Christian virtues and worldview that's established and blessed. The West has blessed our lives, which kind of goes on with science, with biology, things that have not been in debate. They have not been an issue of really arguing these things until 20 minutes ago, and now all of a sudden reality is distorted. So within Title IX, with that being promoted, let's talk about a few of the problems that is going to create culturally, beginning with women's sports. You're always an athlete in a variety of ways. You have your PhD in kinesiology. You work for an organization that is all about fitness, and you could probably give a little thought on that on the back end of where this is going. But just talk about this for a little bit from your perspective, and I have some other things I want to bring up in relation to that as well.
Yeah, so generally in my field of exercise science, I would say the sex differences between males and females have never been called into question until very recently. And one of the things that Title IX does, or the eradication of it, I should say, would do, is allow gender identity to replace biological sex, meaning that a biological male who identifies as a different gender, let's say it is female, although there are several other genders, let's remember, can come into and compete against biological women. And many times, and when that happens, uh, especially in particular in adults, but in children as well. So they've already gone through a male puberty, and they have already established male. I mean, they're male. They're biologically male. They have male
Yeah.
chromosomes. They have male genetics in every sense of the word, and that is what they are. And so we are placing them and saying it's safe for them and appropriate for them to compete against biological females, who we know in many sports, most sports, are at a severe disadvantage. There's a whole host of biological characteristics that are different between men and women. And God created us that way. We are supposed to be. And a lot of times the comment comes up of, oh, well, not all men are good at sports, or not all men are this and that. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It doesn't matter. And also, they are different. Even if they are maybe not as skilled at certain things, biologically, they're different from women. And so not only does this create a safety issue because of we've seen examples of this all over the country, and in Canada in particular, we've seen several examples of this that should be a warning to us, that when biological males are competing against biological women, it is dangerous and can create serious injuries depending on the sport in particular. And so it creates an unfair advantage, obviously, physically, but also all the things that come along with sports, such as scholarship opportunities, locker rooms. That has been a very important part of this, is that, before and after you engage in a sporting event or at a gym or whatever, you're changing, showering, and spending time in spaces that are intended to be sex segregated for a reason. And so
along that line, let me stop you there just for a second. Along that line, I was listening to, her name was Paula Scanlon. She was a former University of Pennsylvania swimmer, and, connected with Riley Gaines and really speaking up through these issues. But she was on the team with, I forget his real name, but he tried to be referred to as Leah Thomas. And she was saying that at one of the meets, you had all these different ages in the locker room, and you literally had this large male, he's 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", and obviously male genitalia and so forth, changing beside a little girl that was like 4 or 5 years old, naked. Anywhere else and anytime else, there would be complete outrage, contacting of authorities. People would take matters in their own hands. I mean, people would say, this is ridiculous, yet because someone bankrupt in their philosophy of life, devoid of morality, makes these things up and throws them into the public sphere, all of a sudden we have to go against all of our instincts of protection, all of the realities that has been a part of civilization from its inception, and we have to pretend that this is somehow okay. And I just thought, as you said that about the locker room, that's such a big deal, and I was just reminded of that, and it's a big issue. But anyway, sorry to interrupt. Continue.
No, that's okay. This ties in nicely to what we talked about in the last podcast about one of the goals of queer theory and the destruction of social norms. I mean, one of the reasons that Title IX was instated was that this type of thing wouldn't happen, and that women could feel safe and protected in spaces where they were their most vulnerable. I was listening to a podcast talking about this very issue, and it was from a lawyer. She was speaking about this. She was from a different country though, and was discussing like how women in their most vulnerable state, don't want to be around men. Maybe they're nursing their baby. Maybe they just had a baby. Maybe they're showering and naked. Like, these are all situations where to a normal person, you would say, yeah, you deserve privacy at the very least with the same sex. You know, those are situations where even when you are around the same sex, it can be really vulnerable. I cannot imagine having a male pretending to be a woman. Many of them are sexually aroused just by being in that very situation because they suffer from something called autogynephilia
Yeah.
in that space while this is happening.
Yeah.
And you know, we can get into that, but that's part of this. I think it's naive to assume that everyone who is going to take advantage of this overturning, this ruling, is a genuinely gender confused person.
Yeah.
That is not true. It's just not true.
Yeah. No, you're 100% correct on that. I wanted to read this. Heritage Foundation senior legal fellow Sarah Perry said in a statement, "Under the new rule, girls and women will no longer have any sex-separated bathrooms, locker rooms, housing accommodations, or other educational programs. Women's sports are likely endangered as well. Any education institution, including many private schools that receive even nominal federal funding, and a significant amount of your Christian schools do, by the way, will be affected by this rule." Perry added that the rule also erases free speech protections for students and teachers who don't want to use preferred pronouns. So now you're not only being forced to pretend with someone, but now you have to celebrate this, what I would say, delusion. Parents' right to know if their child is in a process of gender identity and social transition in school is removed. So it's bringing a separation from parents. And this new regulation is by far one of the most reaching and radical changes to federal rule ever published by the U.S. Department of Education. And she goes on to say, it will have drastic and dire societal consequences touching the lives of practically every student in America. So let's talk about that for a few moments. Let me set it up with this. I was speaking with someone recently that is in the education system, and they were talking to someone in leadership in this particular place about, hey, what are we going to do about this? Because obviously this is an issue for every state, every school, everywhere, federal funding. You know, nothing is ever free. There's always something attached to it, right? What are we going to do about that? And this person, who was a Christian, responded by saying, well, you know what? We're Christians, but we can't force our religion on everyone else. That was their response to Title IX. Which one? I want to attack that for a moment. I would love to meet the person and attack this in person as well, because it's the argument of idiots, and I don't know how else to be nice about that, because this has everything, and it has nothing to do, in a sense. I believe that everything's spiritual and is a religious worldview, but this isn't simply an issue of religion and for fear of not having enough money. Because essentially, if your school, if your college, your high school, your middle school, your elementary school, they are all tied to federal funding. So much so that if they go against this ruling and they don't compel your child to lie to someone and pretend with them that they are the opposite sex and shower with them and do sports with them and all those things, it will potentially bankrupt your school. So they will go along with it. And so we're at a very important point in the history of our nation and culturally right now, where people, do they love money more than they love truth? As I was having that conversation, it makes me so angry, because there's such a lack of courage and a lack of principles within that. Now, it's not an easy topic to I think, enter into and figure out, okay, how do we attack this legally? How do we attack this? Yeah, obviously, by voting. We need to vote against this demonic nonsense. We need to attack it legally. It'll go before the Supreme Court because it just oversteps on every level. But in the meantime, you know, the question is, what are we going to do. So I kind of stirred the pot a little bit just to bring that up. I'd love for you to jump in and continue on and give your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are going to keep encountering situations like this. And on some level, it reminds me of a lot of things that have happened over the last few years as far as making decisions based on your convictions and what that will bring. You know, we saw this similarly with the vaccine, although I think that had a lot more room for interpretation, so to speak.
Sure.
Whereas this is
Agreed.
very clear. Like
Yeah.
this topic, this issue, people know where they stand on it. And
Yes.
everyone knows the truth.
Yeah.
Everyone knows the truth. They're denying biological reality and their innate sense of knowing if someone is a man or a woman and being told to ignore and deny it for the sake of politeness. And I think that's a great place to draw the line personally, but I mean, everyone's going to have to take each situation for what it is. But I do think an important thing to remember is we are on the side of reality. It's not difficult or complicated to believe that we are males and females. Yes, it is a biblical concept. God created us this way. We see that in Genesis. It's very clear and established that this is God's created order. However, anyone with eyeballs who's above the age of 2 years old knows that there's a difference between men and women. And so I think the legal perspective of this is a little bit different. And so if someone is facing something that might affect legally. So I recently heard a story about, for example, just to give it a current event, I guess, a story about someone who was interviewing for a job, and during the interview process and everything seemed totally normal, completely normal. And when they showed up for their first day of employment, they were a furry. And unbeknownst,
explain for the listener, just in case they've been hiding under a rock, what is a furry?
Furries are people who identify as, I guess it could be considered a gender identity. I think it is, as different types of animals. And so frequently you'll see this as dogs, cats. I believe this person was a tiger. We see this in schools with little kids as well, of identifying as different types of animals. And it is based on a sexual fetish. This is something that is very prevalent in pornography. And that's, I think, where it comes from. There are large conventions where these furries gather together for days on end and do all kinds of sexually immoral activities and whatnot. And more recently, we have people openly identifying as furries and the like. So this is when you see individuals or see pictures maybe from things like pride parades and stuff like that, where they have on, fake muzzles, leashes, collars, ears. Sometimes they're in all kinds of like weird costumes and things like that.
Which is even promoted in our military. You can see pictures of generals and others in this. I mean, it's crazy. Anyway, continue.
It seems like a joke, but it's not. And so this person who was hired and shows up to work as a furry, the person who hired them basically said, I believe they did this intentionally so that if I tried to fire them, because clearly this person is mentally unstable, showing up to work dressed as an animal, who would want to hire someone like that? And under things like Title IX, the new ruling to this, that's considered a gender identity, and you cannot discriminate against people based on gender identity. And that's why this opens up a whole can of worms. It's not just, we're just being loving and accepting, and these people just want to be, they want to be discriminated against. This is not that. There may be some people, yes, but it's also the people who want to take advantage of rulings like this and of the compassion and desire to be kind of the people who are going along with it, who will sneak right in too. And that includes the perverts, that includes the weirdos, that includes the people who are evil, will get in through rulings like this, because not everyone is going to have you know, genuine like gender dysphoria, where they're truly just trying to live life as the opposite sex and go unnoticed. That's never what
Correct.
we hear. We never hear about the people like that because they want to go under the radar unnoticed.
Yeah.
This is way more than that. And we talked about that with queer theory too. Like this concept of wanting it to be performative and wanting people to know about it and becoming an activist as part of your new identity. That's all
Yeah.
intertwined. And
Yeah.
so it's not just this well-meaning, compassionate ruling. We really need to think about what this could lead to going unchecked. And the gender identity issue, and by and large, just opens itself up to that because it can be anything. It can be absolutely anything.
Yeah, you're right. You're right about that, and that's how empathy has been weaponized in our culture to prey on people's feelings with nice sayings and slogans that's devoid of reality or what the outcome of that ideology or that worldview or that belief will actually cause. So some people are saying, man, this is so good. We're protecting those who are oppressed. Everybody has been indoctrinated by the cultural Marxism of the day. That views all of society through the lens of an oppressor and oppressed. And so these poor people are oppressed, so we need to bring them in. And so the question then becomes, which those that are progressives refuse to answer. In fact, we had a Supreme Court justice who was a leftist that refused to answer the question, what is a woman? What is a woman? So we know it's a biological human female. That's not difficult. It's always been that. And her response was, I'm not a biologist. And as if you need to have a degree in something to understand reality. So we see that has gone on, especially for those in the progressive trope, those who align themselves with that ideology, because the issue is not the issue is the revolution. And so when you say, why are they pushing these issues that, like, everybody knows it's not true, 2 + 2 = 4, but they keep saying it's 5. Why are they doing that? Because the issue is it's an antichrist spirit that's pervasive, and it's the revolution, meaning it's the war against God, or the upending of all social norms, which are based on a Judeo-Christian ethic. And so even the thing that seems the most nonsensical, even the thing that seems the most apparent, is now called into question, and those people are celebrated for that. So we see, okay, we don't know what a woman is, but we're going to say that someone can be a woman, and we need to accept the fact that they want to be a woman with no explanation. And then someone with a fluid identity, gender fluid, say, well, I feel like a woman today, and I feel like a man, now, and blah, 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 blah. It can go back and forth. And then the average person, and this is a part of Title IX, is compelled speech, where you need to use out of respect and also now out of accusation for your bigotry, which is the well-worn title for anyone that wants to stand up for morality. That if you're going to stand, you're going to say, I don't believe that you are a man or a woman, because you're obviously not. If you're of this biology and the made-up term gender identity, if you don't go with their compelled pronoun or preferred pronoun and address them as they, them, it's she, her, however I feel, then you literally could be removed from your college, from your school, be removed from your sport. You can lose your job as a faculty member. You can now lose your scholarship that you've worked hard because of someone else's delusion and an activist that wants to force you to deny reality. So when Christians say, that's a religious issue, we just need to there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what love your neighbor means, what truth is, and our responsibility kind of within that. So we see the attack vector, if you will, of where this is heading, I think each of us have a responsibility to, and we have to make a decision, because the federal funding doesn't just, it may be in education today, but it doesn't stay there. It goes into corporations. This will come to every facet of society. It will try to come for religious exemptions as well, where you and I have to make a decision. Do we love mammon or money more than we love truth and love God? So I said a lot there, but I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, no, it's true. It is. One of the things I thought of when you were saying that was, my last job prior to the one I have now was in an academic institution, and it was an all-women's college. And I remember when I got hired, sitting through a training, and where we were encouraged to ask the pronouns of all of our students at an all-women's college. And it was a suggestion at that point. I'm sure by now that it's a mandate and required, but even just accepting that as something that is standard practice in somewhere that every student in attendance is a woman, it just is such a it makes you question your sanity, because you're like, why would I even need to do that if this space was created because it was all women? Like, that's the whole point of attending this college in particular, was that you were only around other female students. So a lot of these, sex-based concerns were eradicated just because there were no men. And so what does that mean now? I'm sure, there are very few, I think, all women institutions left in the country, but the few that are, I know, are facing big questions like this. And what's going to be the outcome of that? How is this going to unravel from that perspective? And for those faculty, I can only imagine how difficult that standing up to that would be. And so some people will just choose to go along. And as Christians, we can't do that. I believe that we need to be speaking some truth and sanity into this, because it's going to be way too easy to just get swept up in not saying anything or going along with it. And the truth is that this is a much more important issue to be speaking out against than pretty much all the other stuff that's come up. Like, there have been a lot of other things that Christians have been quick to comment on when it comes to social justice and protecting the oppressed and all of these things. What about women? What about women in our society?
Where's all the feminists?
Yeah. And I think, if I had to guess, I would say a lot of them are very confused about what to even think about this, because on one hand, we're told that, men are oppressive and we need to fight the patriarchy. And at the very same time, we're being told, but a man can be a woman and come into your space unchecked with a beard and a penis, and you can't say anything about it. And if you do, you're the one in the wrong. It just makes no sense. But you do see even prominent feminists be attacked for questioning this, like J.K. Rowling, for example, who's been, all but canceled, so to speak, for just saying the truth. She hasn't even really said anything controversial. She's not a Christian, and she's certainly not standing up for it in the same way we're talking about it necessarily. And she's the author of one of the most popular books of all time, book series of all time. And even she is getting dragged through the mud for this. So we can't expect to just stand up for something like this and not really face any backlash. But at the same time, if we don't preserve this most basic truth of men and women are different, and I don't need a biology degree to say that. I don't need to be highly educated in gender studies to understand that what they're saying makes a woman is not true. Then what? Like, I don't know what to tell you. If you don't feel like you have enough information to do that, then you just need to get some courage to be like, at the very least, I can say that that's the truth. At the very least, that's what I can do.
Yeah. And, it's interesting, how do we how do we come against this? I saw this headline from earlier this week. It says 5 middle school girls refused to compete at the Harrison County Championship track meet last week after a transgender female won her shot put competition by 3 feet. And I saw the video of that. They walked up, they handed the shot put, and they walked away. And they refused to participate. Now, they had been working hard for that opportunity. They were seemingly walking away from all that hard work, but there's something that's more important than just living out your personal dream or desire in the moment, and that's truth. That's reality. And we know that there's something known as the Great Reset. It's not a conspiracy. Klaus Schwab wrote a book on it, and those who refuse to think often say, well, that's a conspiracy theory. That's actually a conspiracy fact, and there's a number of things that's a part of that agenda to 2030. One of them is to push, or that Western culture and morality will be pushed to the breaking point. How do they know that? Well, they're a part. This is a well-constructed effort that's global. It's not just the United States. It's being tied to the giving of aid in countries like Africa and others that refuse to acknowledge this nonsense. I talk to people from other countries, just given my position and opportunity. It's always interesting to hear them talk about it, because they just look at America and they're like, what is up with your country? Like, that don't understand. The people have really they've rose up against it, or they're rising up against these things. They're like, no, we don't want that in our country. Yet here we're like, well, you just need to understand. And that's why I just hate to say it like this, that we're ruled by fools. But that's what happens when good people refuse to engage under some fake spirituality, which just hiding behind, you don't like conflict, you don't want anyone to be against anything, you want to kumbaya, and you want to pretend you're Mr. Rogers or whatever, whatever you want to say there. And when we are silent, even on these most obvious issues, think about that generationally. Now, we've said and talked about this for quite a while, but we know what's coming next, and that's the MAPS, the minor attracted persons. And that is the permissive, the changing of laws and the changing of culture to accept adults having sex with minors or children. And as distasteful and disgusting and horrific, and I'm pro-death penalty, and I think that would be appropriate, there is a push, and has been for a long time, within our culture for that to be accepted. This is interconnected into that. This is a part of the deconstruction of morals and ideals, which goes to queer theory, where everything's acceptable. And if we as adults right now in this culture, in this day, we don't say, listen, I don't care if you're mad, go pound sand. There's a tantrum over there, go ahead and you can, cry yourself to sleep, whatever. But we're not changing the world for you. We're not changing the reality for you. We're not pretending for you. We'll help you. We'll get you help, but we're all not going to become insane because you are. We're going to stay sane and actually help you not be that. If we don't do that right now, we talk about next generation, you're just talking about the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
And what will happen culturally. So I just say, you know what, we need to have courage. You may say, how do we do that? I'm going to give you kind of the last word to bring this all together in a few moments, Brittany. How do we do that? And I just go back again. We all have a platform. We all have a voice. When we stop speaking truth because it's not palatable, it's not acceptable, you're mean, you're unloving, Jesus wouldn't be it that way, be like that, you're just, whatever. When we self-censor what God has told us to proclaim, and when we, God creates Satan counterfeits, when we take reality and pretend it doesn't exist, we lose our soul. We don't just lose the nation. We don't just lose a generation. We lose it all. And I think this is a reminder of these moments that we need courageous people to step up. So, yeah, give some final words about this issue, and then any other encouragement that you'd like to give.
Yeah, so I think, one of the important things to take away from all of this is this didn't just happen overnight. It might seem like all of a sudden this is an issue, and really it wasn't. It's just become really mainstream. And you know, in regard particularly for women, there has been this, I mean, with modern feminism in general, just deconstructing what it means to be a woman on in a social norm, quote unquote, perspective, which is the language that they want. And some of it is to the extreme where, yeah, women aren't allowed to work, or women can only do these specific roles. But in the process of all of that, what got blurred was that men and women are actually different. And so that kind of paved the way of, well, if they're different in things that they can have interests in, which is a good thing, right? We don't want these rigid stereotypes of, if you don't like pink, then you're a boy, right? We want all of that. But we can see, I mean, if you just think about it for a few minutes, we can see how that has kind of shifted, though, everything. And that because we wanted a more broad definition, now there's no definition and distinction, and that's intentional. There needs to not be a distinction between the roles that men and women play in society in order for this all to be accepted more easily. And so I think it's really important that, yes, we all have a voice, and I think, women, we need to stand up for ourselves. We also need men to stand up for us and to, be fighting this for us and with us, because it can be very intimidating to be having a lot of these conversations. And, I mean, I've never been in this situation, but I can only imagine how intimidating it would be to be in a locker room with a grown man especially as a young person, and, never have maybe even been exposed to any of this stuff before. Like, you've never seen a naked man before, potentially, if you're a young child. And that's just, I mean, it's an attack on children. It's an attack on innocence. And we need to think about that when we're thinking about how we might be a little bit uncomfortable saying something. Like, yes, we might be a little bit uncomfortable, but what ultimately is at stake here is so much more important. And if that's hard for you to think about, just think about it happening to your own child. Like, what if your daughter was Riley Gaines, or one of these other young women who have had to encounter this, who have worked so hard to achieve something, just to have it taken away by a mentally disturbed adult man who thinks that they're a woman. Like, just think about it in the context of if it were you. It's really easy to just kind of, oh yeah, that's terrible, whatever, and kind of disconnect from it because it's not happening to you personally. But if it were to happen to you personally, wouldn't you want people standing up for you and defending you and saying, no, this is absolutely crazy, and we aren't going to just sit around and let it happen to our daughters? Like, yeah, I think we can all say, yeah, that we wouldn't want it to happen to our own kids, but it's going to, potentially, if we don't stop and realize that this is moving forward. This isn't just going to go away.
Yes.
And as the adults, we have to handle it, because our kids are going to have to know unfortunately, our kids are going to have to know how to handle it. We're going to have to be able to defend them and speak up when these things happen, even little things that might seem like small compromises at first, like the pronouns. It just leads to chaos. And so I think as Christians in particular, we can be kind about it. That doesn't mean we have to compromise what we believe is true. And, we can approach it in a way that we believe God has equipped us to. And that might mean having small conversations here and there with your mom friends or your parent friends or whoever, or even people at church, to just be like, hey, how would you handle this? How do you handle this? Because we need support too. And so you're not alone when you're dealing with all of these, current events and stuff. There are other people who are going to be going through this too. And we need to lean on each other as the body of Christ to be like, we know that this is the truth. And if we ultimately want to see people set free and to come to Jesus, we can't pretend like what they're believing about gender and about all these issues is going to, give them more empathy points and they get a fast track to heaven or something. We can't pretend like that's what's happening here. And so I would just encourage everyone to not ignore it, and not to say like, oh, I hate this. It's just so political. I don't like talk. I get it. But at the same time, if we're all like that, nothing is going to change. And this is just going to get worse.
Yeah. Kind of closing thought, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I have read a bit about him, and he was a political dissident in fighting the Soviet Union, or against communism and everything that was happening there. He said something that I'd like to close this podcast with. He said, referring to the state, he said, the most important thing to the state is the lie. And he said, we know they are lying. They know they are lying. They know we know they are lying. We know they know we know that they are lying, but they keep on lying. And his point is whatever the state says became true. And we have the privilege to live in the freest country in the history of humanity. And we're losing that freedom because we are believing the lie. And these lies, just like in communist Russia, just like tyranny that has spread all over the world throughout history, it doesn't take a deep dive, just look at the last 100 years. Going along to get along and believing these propagandized, well-constructed lies will only enslave you and destroy everything in its path. So you and I have in a moment, let's not allow the erasure of women. God created men and women in his likeness. They're precious, have great calling, and so let's honor the femininity that God has brought into this world, and let's not pretend with the author of confusion, who is Satan himself. Let's stand for what is right. You can, whatever title it is, whatever it takes, whatever it costs us, may we stand courageously in this hour for truth. Brittany, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope this message has inspired you to courageously stand up, speak up, and to live out your faith. If you like what you heard today, give me a 5-star review, follow the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, and share it with others to learn how to stand for truth in the midst of culture.